Assalamu alaikum. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It gives National Bank of Oman great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Chairman Speaker Series. Thank you for joining us.
Oman is a great country in a region that is at the center of world attention. Our people are young, with many ambitions and dreams for the future.
The title of my talk this evening may come as a surprise to you, to many of you at least, who would probably connect oil in Oman with the 1960s. I landed on the small airstrip at Beit el-Falaj at the beginning of 1972 and drove to the British Embassy in Old Muscat in a Land Rover along one of the few cemented roads in the whole of the country. I also remember how I left Muscat 2 years later along a six-lane highway from the new international airport at Sib. That was astonishing progress. You have all seen for yourselves how this progress has continued apace ever since, with oil and gas revenues as the driving force under the guidance of His Majesty Sultan Qaboos and his government.
Mubadala has established a reputation worldwide for doing things differently. The result is making lasting contributions to its own and neighboring countries.
The first platform is aerospace and engineering services, which encompasses our interests in information and communication technologies and defense services.
And where in the equation does the factor of bottom line and profit come in? How driven are you by that particular aspect?
Well, I'm a believer of financial viability brings economic sustainability. So employment creation is critical, but for employment creation to continue to be sustainable and beneficial, it needs to be based on a financial reality and a financial viability. So any business we're involved in, while the objective always is to be, when I'm talking about domestically in the UAE, create jobs, it has to be commercial. It has to be commercial.
Could you talk to us maybe about one or two of the failures that you've had and what you've learned from those?
Drive commercialization of the space industry. Anusha and her family provided title sponsorship.
Other technologies that excites me about space and why I go around and talk about space is space power solar satellites, energy.
When we launched this initiative back in December 2014, we wanted to create a platform where inspirational global leaders from diverse disciplines could share their experiences, their knowledge, their ideas, their aspirations with a cross-section of our society.
There is no way you can make it if you do not work hard. No way. No way. There is no shortcut. And that's a discussion I have between me and Rashid. And I say, you know, if I can live again and come back to a 20-year-old, I'll probably work day and night. Maybe I'll sleep after the age of 35. Why not, right? Some people are brave, they do that. But I'm saying that there is no shortcut. They say the harder you work, the luckier you get. والالتزام الانضباط. We can say that Steve Jobs or somebody that, oh my God, what great thing he created. He tried to do 100 things and he failed. 100, 150, and he fails and gets up again.
What can we, as Omanis, learn from Dubai? In what can we learn to do, and what can we learn not to do?
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Your Highnesses, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, Welcome to the 5th edition of NBO Chairman Speaker Series. Thank you for joining us this evening. We are honored to welcome our distinguished guest speaker, Dr. Paul Achleitner, Chairman of the Supervisory Board of Deutsche Bank. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to hand over to NBO's Chairman, Mr. Mohammed bin Mahfouz Al-Ardi.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, our distinguished guests. Every quarter of a year, we get together like this, and we invite a seasoned global personality to come and talk to us about a success story. When we started this program, we really thought that finance is about ideas. And it is with ideas that finance come alive. And for this concept to come true, we really need to have an exchange of ideas. And so at the National Bank of Oman, one of our main targets and main responsibilities, we feel, is facilitating this exchange of ideas. So this Chairman Speaker Series is really an idea to bridge the gap between Oman's youthful and hopeful youth and the people in the world with great stories, with success stories, with inspirational stories. And so tonight, we have an amazing guest, one of really the important people in the world of finance. A friend and colleague that we've served together at the advisory board of the Brookings. But Dr. Paul Achleitner is the chairman of Deutsche Bank. I'm not going to go through all his bio, which you have and you have read, but I just want to say a couple of words about him and where he sits. I think he has one of the most exciting jobs, but probably also one of the most challenging jobs that you can have. He's chairing a bank that is 150 years old, with a balance sheet of around $2 trillion, but a bank with a lot of history, intertwined in the history of humanity, some of it good, some of it challenging. He inherited this bank that had a lot of cases of litigation. He was losing money. He was challenged after the financial crisis. A man like him, who is an important voice in the financial system, sitting on one of Europe's largest banks, in one of Europe's, actually not in one of Europe's, in Europe's biggest economy. So tonight he has, despite his challenging calendar, despite his business commitments, he has accepted to come and talk to us and share with us how is it challenging and what to do to actually get out of crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to welcome Dr. Paul Achleitner.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear Mohammed, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me. Thank you then for actually coming and listening to me, because I know that there are many things going on, and I'm quite honored that so many of you have turned out here tonight. I have to admit that I'm normally very reluctant to accept speaking engagements, because after all, normally one rarely learns something new by listening to oneself, at least hopefully. But this case is very different. not only because of my friend Mohammed giving me this invitation, but also because the few times that my family and I have been in Oman, we have actually grown rather fond of the country. So thank you very much again for having this opportunity. And I know that given the great history of Oman as a trading center, which I understand began many thousands of years ago, and all the evidence that Oman is a true meeting place of cultures navigating South Asia, Middle East, and Africa, which means that while I'm here to talk to you about the state of the global economy, your historical experience with openness, trade, and commerce means already that you understand deeply the ways in which the global economy matters to your fortunes and to those of others. Yet today, I would argue that the global economy is in a kind of a malaise. It remains 7 years after the big financial crisis in a somewhat less than normal state. In 2007, we thought we knew what normal was. Take Europe, for example. In 2007, normal meant base rates at 4%, unemployment rates at 7.5%, inflation at just under 2%. Yet today, base rates are negative, unemployment is around 11%, and inflation is hovering around 0. Predicting that the Eurozone would be flirting with the specter of a long-term deflation of the kind that Japan faced would have seemed an extreme view in a pre-crisis world, yet here we are. These are unusual times. Unprecedented policy experiments have numbed us to the strangeness of our current predicaments. The further we get from 2007, the less it seems we can get back on a convincing path to normalization. Sure, the Fed will most likely raise its rates this week, but what are the Fed numbers predicting 2 years out? A piddling 1.5%, implying a hike of about half of the level of actual previous rate hikes and cycles. This is not what we normally think of as a recovery. Consider what central banks have done since 2008. Interest rates remain at historical lows. Indeed, in all the 200-year-plus history, the Bank of England has never had a lower rate than today. The Fed, which was founded later, is also at an all-time low, while 4 European central banks have decided to pursue negative policy rates. The 5 major developed market central banks have expanded their balance sheets by $7.5 trillion since the end of 2007, equivalent to 40% of US total GDP. Moreover, quantitative easing has turned markets into a ward of the state. The BOJ, the Bank of Japan, owns 30% of outstanding JGBs, and the Fed 17% of treasuries. Despite this accommodation and some signs of growth in recent years, growth remains lackluster relative to recent history. Let's take Europe, the US, and emerging markets each in turn. Nearly 17 years after its inception, the Eurozone is still unstable. Growth remains too low. The most ambitious forecasts over the next 2 years imply just over 2% growth annually. In the short run, Europe is held back by a lack of competition, still deficient credit supply, and the profound need for structural reforms. These reforms are politically difficult and don't often yield economic benefits in the short run. For instance, Italy's recent labor market reforms only lifted the growth potential by 0.2%. As a result, the long-term growth picture remains unpromising. Moreover, the crisis has left legacy debts, and Europe faces structural disadvantages which it needs to tackle, including weaker demographics, lack of investment and innovation, higher energy costs. One way to see this is in our unemployment rate. In Greece and Spain, nearly half of all young people are unemployed, while in both, nearly a quarter of the adults are. In the US, the current recovery is in its 7th year, but growth has been unspectacular. Total output has moved above its pre-recession peak, but economic growth has averaged only about 2% per year, well below its historical average. In the American context, the expansion is already the worst on record since World War II. Economists have raised the prospect of secular stagnation, where US and other major global economies might not return to full employment and strong growth without unconventional fiscal spending. Indeed, they point to the present underperformance as a kind of reverse 1990s, a moment of sharp decelerating productivity growth. Politically, confidence in public institutions is at a low ebb, and the rise of very extreme views in politics has been a feature of this election cycle. Nevertheless, from the perspective of the rest of the world, the US is the healthiest advanced economy. Indeed, the reason the market expects the Fed to raise rates today, or this week, is because the Fed's objectives on unemployment and inflation are close to being met. In emerging markets, the growth backdrop is difficult as a boom period ends. The golden age of emerging market is likely to be behind us, as the tailwinds that supported growth in the first decade of the century have faded or turned. Emergence of China and its integration with the world economy, the so-called commodity supercycle, favorable demographics, etc. In some countries like Brazil, right now, the inflation rate is higher than the head of government's approval rating. Emerging markets continue to grow faster than developing markets, but the growth premium of emerging markets over developed markets has halved in the last couple of years. Even as growth appears to be bottoming out, the outlook in emerging markets is generally bleak, with low commodity prices hurting producers and China weakness weighing especially on Asia. With the notable exception of India, growth in the larger emerging markets is slow. Brazil, Russia are both in recession. South Africa and Turkey are also particularly weak. The real emerging market Achilles heel, however, is corporate debt. BIS data suggests that the amount of US dollar-denominated debt issued by non-US, non-financial corporates stood at US dollars 9 trillion in 2014, a 50% increase in 5 years. 3.5 trillion of this total were issued by emerging market corporates, 1/3 by China, another 15 to 20% by India, Brazil, and Turkey. However, I don't want to alarm you too much. We are unlikely to see a large wave of corporate defaults, evolving into balance sheet payments crisis and a default akin to the emerging market crisis of the 1980s and 90s, because the majority of borrowers have dollar revenues, have hedged currency positions, and have limited near-term maturities. From all of what I have just said, which is a reasonably bleak picture, if you want to, I think you could see the last 7 years as a series of perpetual crises rather than a long recovery. Certainly, you could imagine three legs to the financial crisis: the US from 2008-2009, Europe from 2010 to 2012, and now the emerging markets. The real question, of course, is how do we move beyond this destabilizing dynamic of low growth, weak wage growth, and low productivity? Broadly, there are three government levers that one can pull: monetary policy, fiscal policy, and structural reforms. Let's talk about those. I think we have certainly flogged somewhat the horse of monetary policy. Yet despite seeming to be consequence-free, there are financial and social limits to monetary policy. Ultra-accommodative monetary policy, and quantitative easing in particular, has created significant asset price distortions. These blur the price signals that are needed for financial markets to allocate capital efficiently. This ultra-loose monetary policy produced low global sovereign yields and compressed term premia. As a result, we have seen a massive rally in risk assets in the last few years. At one point this year, equities were breaking through all-time highs. US and Europe equities nearly doubled since mid-2011. S&P 500, DAX, and Stoxx 600 at all-time highs in May and April and May. Shanghai Composite more than doubled over the last year. Corporate bond yields close to all-time lows across the credit space, and several episodes of spreads in the tightest quarter relative to history. QE's distributional effects have also prompted a great deal of concern. As we expand QE in Europe, this will rise in importance as an issue of further concern. Unlike changes to policy rates, QE impacts the shape of the yield curve, reducing long-term yields, effectively shifting wealth from savers to borrowers. And by purchasing MBS, the Fed pushed down mortgage rates, stimulating housing demands and raising home values. This benefits disproportionately those at the upper end of the income distribution. The appreciation of risky financial assets massively benefits the top 10% of the wealth distribution, which in the US own 90% of all equities. Between 2009 and 2012, the average income of the bottom 90% in the US has fallen by 2%. While the top 0.01% have enjoyed an increase of 37%. That's probably not sustainable. Fiscal policy is also approaching its limits. Household debts are stretched, and aging is increasing the magnitude of fiscal challenges ahead. It is difficult to see fiscal policy playing a sustained, large role in returning our economies back to normal. Some economists have suggested that we rethink the austerity policies since 2008 and pursue instead an expansionary fiscal policy. Just as homeowners can afford larger mortgages when rates are low, they argue government can sustain higher deficits. Yet it is hard to see how fiscal policy can be expansionary given the major challenges in public finance that exist. Rather than in reducing indebtedness or deleveraging, all major economies today have higher levels of borrowing relative to output than they did in 2007. Since 2007, global debt has increased by $57 trillion, outpacing world GDP growth. And on that growth, government debt comprises about half. Moreover, aging is going to make matters worse. If current federal spending patterns in the US for Social Security and healthcare are maintained, the percentage of GDP spent would rise sharply to 14% by 2040, more than twice the 6.5% over the past 50 years. This leaves us with structural reforms, which may be the only option of how to deal with some of these challenges. At its simplest, structural reforms, of course, mean opening economies to competition. This increases the efficiency with which resources are allocated. In Europe, structural reform means four things in particular: reforming labor markets, taxation, product markets, and service markets. And this, Mohammed, is where I actually change my speech from giving you a further lecture on economics, which is the great thing that I have been given to present to you today. But based on our discussions, I thought I'd like to actually take a step back and talk about structural reforms and structural challenges that I personally believe are the biggest issues that all of us have to confront, and maybe also try to